Hi guys, welcome back to another YouTube video. So I'm going to do a short YouTube series on Keynesian economics. In particular, I'm going to be doing an introduction to how Keynesian economics came about. I'm then going to do a video on the Keynesian cross, and then I'm going to follow that up with a video on the ISLM model. I used to have videos on ISLM on my channel, but I took them down a while back with the best of intentions of kind of like refilming some and putting them up. I just thought they were poor quality, thought there were bits where I could have explained it more, and I really didn't do a very good job at motivating why sort of like Keynesian or ISLM came about, and I feel that's such a shame. And then time passed, I didn't put new ones up, and then as more time passed, I came a bit reluctant to putting them up because I thought maybe that the ISMP model is what universities are trying to steer more towards, as it better describes what monetary policy behaviour or central bank behaviour in developed countries. But actually, you know what? The change hasn't been that big. A lot of universities still teach ISLM, and there's nothing stopping me from just uploading both of them. So I will also do that at some point in the near future. So please enjoy. Your topic video today is just introducing Keynesian economics, and then we will go from there. Of why Keynesian economics came about before we try and move on to any other topic within Keynesian economics. So, firstly, what do we have, I suppose, pre-Keynesian economics? So, pre-Keynesian, so before we had all Keynesian economics came about, we had what was known as classical economics. And this was the main school of thought, and it actually described what was happening in economies in countries quite well. Okay, so then, whatever led to the introduction of Keynesian economics? Well, what happened is in the 1930s, we had what was known as the Great Depression. And what was happening in this time period is we found that countries, especially the US, they were experiencing mass unemployment, and they were still experiencing mass unemployment even when incomes or wages were being reduced. This goes against classical economics, because classical economics would have argued, well, if for whatever reason we've got unemployment, if we were to cut wages, then this would solve the issue. But actually, we were finding that that's not the case. We were cutting wages and we were in a kind of like a downward spiral. Now, let's have a little think. I know I don't really want to talk about Keynesian economics, but let's have a think about why this went against the classical economics. So, firstly, in classical, it wouldn't explain what was happening, didn't. It didn't explain what was happening in the 1930s very well. So it didn't explain the situation. And part of the reason why that is the case is because under classical, wage reductions would restore full employment. Okay, so this is something to think about then. So why is this the case? Well, under classical, what we know that there was something known as Say's law. And you've probably heard this in class, and all this is this idea that supply creates its own demand. So it was this idea that supply was the important factor. If you were producing things, then it would just create its own demand, and that's essentially what would keep the economy going. So production is key. Therefore, if you were to ever have unemployment, it was seen as an imbalance, and it was seen as, well, it must be that there are overly high wages and it's affecting or disrupting supply. So if unemployment exists, it's because there are too high wages affecting supply. So what you could think about that is well, the wages are so high that jobs aren't willing to hire people, and if jobs aren't hiring people, then there's not workers producing things in the economy, and therefore you've got unemployment. And well, you've got unemployment, and you've also got kind of like stagnant or lowering economic growth, okay? And you also found that in the 1930s. So that's affecting supply. Fine, and they did. They tried the whole classical idea, and they tried to cut wages to see if that would go on to fix things. Now, this in itself, you know, nowadays might seem a bit silly, because why is it, if there's like this unemployment, why is it got to be that the wages are too high? Why can't it be that actually wages are too low? And it's all because kind of like the underlying assumptions under classical is this idea that workers would it's the premise that workers would rather take lower wages over unemployment. And actually nowadays we don't think that's the case. That was kind of like the underlying assumption under classical economics. So when this wasn't working out, we ended up having, Keynes came along, I think his theory book came out in something like 1936. Keynes came along and he said, well, actually, what happens if things really aren't kind of like supply side and actually the demand side? And what's happening here is that Keynes argued that lower incomes are further lowering aggregate demand and kind of like thus exacerbating the situation. Okay, and so Keynes came along after this happening in the 1930s, and the whole classical theory wasn't panning out very well, and Keynes argued that lower incomes, well, are potentially further lowering aggregate demand because you don't have much income and therefore you can't spend as much, and it's kind of like a perpetuating cycle, and therefore it's further exacerbating this situation. And therefore Keynes was the one that was kind of advocating for government intervention here. And therefore we have this whole kind of birth of Keynesian economics, and this is when we can go into things such as the Keynesian cross and ISLM. So that was just a quick introduction to the kind of the birth of Keynesian economics, and then from here we're going to look into some of the classic models. So I hope this helps.